All right, welcome back to another episode of Focus on EDU. As always, excited to be here. My name is Doug Konopelko with CDW Education. Can't wait for today's guest. This one's been a long time coming. We tried to get this episode going, and then we both had crazy schedules, presenting all over, just doing all kinds of things. But I have Amanda Latasha Armstrong on today, and if I tried to tell you all the different things she does and the work she's involved with, I wouldn't do it justice. So I'm going to bring her in and she can tell us herself.
Great. Thanks for bringing me in, Doug. So as you said, my name is Amanda Latasha Armstrong. I am representing both New Mexico State University and New America. So at New Mexico State University, I'm a doctoral candidate in the College of Education, Health Education and Social Transformation. And then I also work at the Learning Games Lab at the university as a Games Lab coordinator. And then with New America, I'm a research fellow with their education policy program.
All right, so that's a lot of things, a lot of different topics and roads we can go down. Maybe, at the heart of the work you're doing, sort of where does that lie?
Yeah, I would say the heart of what I do is working to create digital learning environments and technology learning environments that really are strength-based, that support the whole child, that support their families and communities. And so either I think about that in terms of pedagogical practices with technology tools, or I think about it from the sense of technology development and materials. And so there are different ways in which I kind of approach it, and I tend to be interdisciplinary. So I am informed by Black feminism, by critical pedagogies like multicultural education, as well as just like game design itself. And so those kind of influence me and help me think about what are the ways to construct either learning environments or materials.
Excellent. So, what does all of that look like maybe in your work right now, either at New America or New Mexico State?
Yeah, so I would say that for New America, what that looks like is distilling research or like kind of summarizing research and giving opportunities for how it applies to teaching and learning practices and also product development. So, for instance, I did a meta-analysis on research. A meta-analysis on social group representation in different kinds of educational materials. And so, I tended to look at like racial, ethnic, and gender groups. And so, I compiled a lot of different studies, over 100 studies, and then gave kind of some takeaways from that. And so then that really kind of helps thinking about for teachers how they're looking at materials themselves, maybe some ways they can evaluate it. For people who develop materials, it's about like, well, what aren't the materials doing? What maybe we can do differently? How do we create better design processes? And so that's one way it shows up in my work in New America. In the Games Lab work, it really kind of shows up in the summer sessions that we hold. So when recently I talked about kind of how our think tank sessions, which we call them, which was our summer youth programs, how we integrate both culturally responsive teaching practices and universal design teaching and learning practices when we're creating these learning experiences where the kids are learning about design. And so in that way, it's implemented from that standpoint.
So, what were some of the takeaways of the analysis that you did for New America?
So some of the takeaways were one was creating a sense of belonging, that we need to have educational materials that really represent communities. And for this research report, I looked at racial, ethnic, and and gender groups. And so they really kind of found that there was often narrow representations of different groups. So there is some shift and some movement to having more like fuller, complex stories. We still need more of that for different groups. And we still need that in the terms of them representing being a part of the US history, being a part of the US curriculum, that we're making sure that we're integrating different groups, as well as thinking about showing those fuller characters doing different things, engaged in different roles and different activities and such. So there are those are just some of the takeaways, but definitely read the whole research report to just also find out what are the ways that different groups are represented and what are ways that we can make improvements.
So, for folks who create either instructional materials, content, or ed tech platforms and content along that line. What do you think are some good suggestions for them moving forward that help incorporate some of the work that you've done?
I think one thing that can happen is creating evaluation, like creating a criteria if you're an educator or even a product developer. So it could be based on the information about, for instance, for some racial and ethnic groups, like making sure that you're not showing them related to stereotypes. And so in the issue brief, I actually have a table of all of the, like I kind of tried to summarize like what are some of the ways in which certain racial and ethnic groups are. So you could kind of use that and say, like, use that to kind of check and be and say, are we ensuring that we're having these fuller characteristics or fuller stories of these different communities? And I think also it could be something that could be used to look at other social group identities. So yes, I only looked at really three, but I would say, like, look at what about representation of different ability groups, different languages, different regions. And so I think also using that to help expand maybe kind of the language we could use to evaluate. And I think in the process of product development, it could be integrated within the process itself. So, like, do you have these check systems or ways in which you're accounting for representation within the design process so you don't kind of get to the end of designing whatever kind of digital product you're creating and you're like, oh wait, we completely reinforce this stereotype, or we completely didn't even think about including this, or we inaccurately portrayed this person in this way. And so I think, like, also just thinking about ways you can evaluate in the process of development and design would be helpful too.
Yeah, I think too, one of the things that I'm sure you speak to in the work is also going deeper into those, right? Trying to embed those, like you said, as a process during, right? So that you don't get to the end of creating a product or creating a system and then kind of say, oops, we forgot everything. Um, but it's also, I think, goes beyond then simply like counting the number of pictures of different people, right?
Yes, and so I've actually had that, I've had several conversations about that, which is I think it's a kind of about sitting with different stories, and I think it's our own kind of growth and development. So yes, you can use kind of this evaluation system, but really thinking about, and I wrote a follow-up piece for that where we had a roundtable of developers talk about like actual processes they can do. So I recommend people refer to that and really look at specifics, but like some of the things were, are you inviting people who are experts or who know the specific community or the audience into your design process? Like really thinking about co-design as an approach to doing something, rather than and really integrating them in your processes. And every studio, every place has their own processes, and so thinking about how can you create meaningful dialogue and meaningful integration rather than the check marks. And I think for my teacher and learning standpoint, thinking about getting to know your children, their families, their communities, and because like one thing that they noted a lot um, in the studies were that usually groups are kind of stereotype or limited to maybe representing one group. So one thing, like a lot of people noted that within representations of Asian Americans, it was also it was often about Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans. And so researchers also noted that there was a limited like representation of the variations within this racial group. And then there are also ethnicities within those particular groups as well. And so I think part of it is getting to know our children and families, and getting to know kind of the particulars, because even within different communities that there are variations. And then also thinking about how are we integrating different communities, so not necessarily only those that reflect the children and families and communities that you're working with, but also different communities as well as outside of that. And how are we including them as well? And I think it is about trying to find things that are accurate as well, because sometimes even with the counting, it's just kind of a frequency. It's just kind of like the counting, but really like what is it saying? And so sometimes it's us having communities of other educators where we talk to each other, where we're like maybe saying we're trying to find materials to use for something. It could be games, it could be books, or digital books, or any kind of digital materials, and having kind of check-in groups with the community of educators who have different experiences, different perspectives, and having conversation about it. Because it is a process. There isn't a like one way to do this, but in order to move beyond the check boxes, we do have to have kind of that critical dialogue ourselves amongst peers, and then also critical thinking and reflection on the materials themselves.
Yeah, and I think so many folks are looking for a tool, right? And you have these conversations and they agree and they say, yes, so what do I need to do, right? And I think the hard part is sometimes saying like you just have to be ready to have these conversations, right? Over and over again as you're building materials, and not just through this one lens, right? Of saying, like you said, it's not just race, right? It's looking through all of these lenses and the intersectionality of it, and understanding that just counting again not isn't really the end goal. It's being engaged in the dialogue around building more inclusive and supportive materials.
Yes, and counting can be a start. So I don't want to discourage people from counting. I
Right.
think that it can be a way of entry of opening. And I even started out with counting. Like part of even the analysis I did was it was counting like what is like who is represented? What are the content analysis saying about different groups? And so I think it's a really great way to begin to talk about it. And then as we were talking about now, like what does it mean to go next? And so that's why even in the analysis I did, I wanted to make sure I included how our different groups portrayed, because often we talk about frequency in the county, but like what is the depth, what is the substance of who's being portrayed and how? And then maybe like what do we need to think, what is working? What are some promising practices that people are saying, like, oh, when you have stories in this way, or we have these recommendations, like people have been saying that and really kind of honing in and then kind of summarizing that and saying, here are some common things that people are saying. And then I think in looking at that, if you're looking at maybe racial, ethnic, and gender groups, and then saying, okay, and I like, what about ability groups? Because there is research out there that talks about the limited representation of people of different abilities and different, like so there's that, and so there are these research, and so I would say even if you start out with something with the research report and then decide to build on that and say, I would like to further look at this social group. And maybe if you're working with a group of teachers, or if you have a peer group that you all maybe meet with, like maybe a few times a year, like you maybe people take on looking at representation or what people are saying about how different groups are presented, and then maybe thinking about what you can do or what the community can do that you're a part of can do differently in their own practice. And so it's a constant learning. Like I'm constantly learning and engaging in dialogue with peers. I also have my times where I miss different things because my own lived experience is, as a Black woman. But and so having, a Black family, so there are things that even I may miss because I'm also able-bodied. So even understanding my own identities and my own way of living in the world helps me understand that there may be things that I don't necessarily think about. And so having even a community of educators helps me become better at like not only choosing materials, but also thinking about what is the way I'm approaching teaching and learning that will help support all the students I'm working with. So it's about if you want to choose culturally responsive education or culturally sustaining education or culturally relevant, but like there are these different pedagogies that can then be applied to say like, am I also creating a learning environment that supports the students as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we get caught up in the folks that we see and work with all the time, right? And so to your point as well, you end up when you evaluate a piece, or if we talked a lot about in our previous conversation about like speaking at conferences, right? And you go to speak on a panel, and a lot of people now, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but yes, a lot of people now are doing, I think, a better job of providing balanced viewpoints. But I think what we're also seeing is there's a difference between providing balanced viewpoints and saying, okay, now we have Amanda here. So Amanda is a black woman, and that is two different things that we were looking for in this panel. Like it's going beyond that, right? And it's just thinking about what kind of experiences are we trying to build at our conference. What are the kinds of voices that we need to make sure we're including? And yes, there is a piece of it that we do need to be wary of, to your point of saying we still do need to do some counting, right? Someone needs to notice, absolutely. But then how do we move the work beyond that? So what does all of that then look like at the game lab?
I would say that that looks like so one way that that can happen is so the participants who come who range in different grades, um, they um, they really kind of get to know and get to play different kinds of games. And so one thing that they do is they critically evaluate games, and that's been happening since before I even joined the lab. Like they started in 2005, around that time, and have consistently built on that. And I've always looked at developing children and youth like game design and game review skills. And I think when it comes to what we do now and thinking about us and implementing our toolkit and thinking about the activities we have in that is about how do we also create opportunities for culturally responsive education as well as like UDL. So a lot of the activities that we do, we try to give different ways of them to even like review and share information. So for instance, in their design project, what they have to do at the end, so they do a presentation and a prototype. And so it gives students who vary, like maybe in different interests that they have and maybe ability to do different things, ways to contribute. So some may say, I want to put the presentation together or put the content together. Some may say, I want to draw the art for the prototype, or like, but there are different ways in which they can enter into the process. And this is a game that they're pitching based on something that they're interested in. And so they work with their partner or with like maybe a group of three of them will work together to be able to one generate an idea based on like they've learned about like game design, game mechanics, they've played and reviewed a lot of games, understood that games can be on a different topic, where they then say, what do I want to create? And then they collaborate and work together to decide what is the idea that they want to present to everyone. So I think it's about like even in that process, they give each other feedback. And it's about even me as an educator and the other educators that are there to be able to ensure that we're creating space for them to be able to share their ideas throughout the process. So they will share their idea about their game before they even work on the pitch, get feedback from peers, they get feedback from each other, they practice it. And so there's this constant like dialogue where they know that where we try to help them understand that their perspective is valued, they're valuable, their voice is valuable, where they feel comfortable like sharing what they're thinking and thinking through process. And so really in that process itself, they not only, like think about, yes, they think about the review itself, but also when we're thinking about those multiple perspectives, they're bringing in their own perspectives and they're also listening to their peers' perspectives. We have perspectives as well. And so it becomes kind of this dialogue where even they feel comfortable over time sharing their perspective.
Love it. Well, if people want to be able to either catch up with you or your work or just learn more about the topics that we covered today, where should they go?
So they can follow me on social media. On Twitter, I'm at Amanda Latasha. I'm also on LinkedIn as well. So I would say you can definitely reach out to me on social media and feel free to contact me and stay connected in that way. And also, I do have websites with New America. So I have a web address with New America as well as with NMSU, but also feel free to go to social media because that might be an easier way to contact me.
Sounds great. And we can put some links in the show notes for folks as well. That way they've got them. So thank you so much for being on today and sharing some of your story with us.
Great. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can be notified whenever we post new content. Looking forward to seeing you next time.